The world ended not with a bang, but with a murmur. It began one ordinary afternoon, a whisper threading through the airwaves, slipping between breaths and sighs. No one knew where it came from. It wasn't loud, just persistent. At first, people ignored it. Then they tried to explain it. By the time they started to fear it, it was already too late. Now, the cities were empty. Streets that once thrummed with life were silent, save for the occasional gust of wind that stirred the ash. Cars sat rusting in the streets, their windows dusted over with the grey residue of what used to be people. Buildings loomed like gravestones, their windows black and empty. It had been 6 months since the murmur swept across the globe. Humanity had unravelled quickly, leaving only scattered survivors like Hannah. She crept through the skeleton of a shopping mall, her steps as soft as possible on the cracked tiles. Her flashlight flickered weakly, the batteries nearing their end. In her hand was a sharpened crowbar, the only weapon she trusted. Hannah wasn't searching for supplies this time. She was looking for the source of the sound, the constant low static that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. At first, the murmur had been almost soothing, like white noise. People joked about it, calling it the hum of the end times on social media. Then it started speaking. Not words exactly, more like impressions, feelings, ideas planted directly into the mind. Some people swore it gave them clarity, insight into the universe. They began gathering in parks, squares and rooftops, standing still as statues with their faces tilted skyward. They smiled as they dissolved, their bodies collapsing into fine grey ash that drifted on the wind. Others resisted. They wore headphones, stayed underground, or fled to remote places. But no matter where they hid, the murmur always found them, and if you heard it long enough, it changed you. Hannah hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. Her last human contact had been a brief alliance with a scavenger named Mark. He'd saved her from one of the distorted, creatures that had once been human, but no longer were. Their flesh was misshapen, their movements jerky, as though they were being puppeted by something unseen. They hunted the living relentlessly, drawn to noise, light, or even the faintest trace of emotion. Mark had taught her the rules. Stay quiet. Stay hidden. Don't listen to the whispers. He hadn't followed his own advice. One night he'd removed his headphones just for a moment. Hannah had watched as his face slackened, his eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful," he'd whispered before the transformation began. She ran, leaving him behind. Now she was alone, creeping through the desolation. The air inside the mall was heavy, tinged with the faint coppery scent that always preceded the distorted. Her flashlight caught glimpses of shattered glass, tattered mannequins and rotting shelves. She paused by a sporting goods store, her heart pounding as the static grew louder. She didn't know why she kept moving toward it. Logic told her to turn back, to run far and fast. But something deep inside compelled her forward. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was madness, or maybe it was the hope that if she found the source, she could end this nightmare. The static rose in intensity as she reached the food court. The space was vast and open, its tables overturned and coated in ash. In the centre of the room stood a figure. At first glance it looked human, a man, tall and thin, with long arms that hung limply at his sides. But as Hannah stepped closer, she saw its head was wrong, elongated and pulsing faintly, as though something inside it was alive. The figure turned toward her, and Hannah froze. Its face was smooth, featureless except for a wide slit where a mouth should have been. The slit opened, revealing rows of needle-like teeth, and from within came the murmur. "Hannah," it said, her name twisting into a low, resonant hum. "You don't have to run anymore." She raised the crowbar, her hands trembling. "Stay back." The figure didn't move. Instead, the air around it rippled, the static warping into something almost melodic. It was inside her head now, pressing against her thoughts, peeling back her memories. Images of her family flashed before her, her mother's laugh, her father's warm embrace, her little brother's shy smile. All of them gone, dissolved into ash when the whispers came. "They're waiting," the murmur said through the creature. "You can join them." Hannah staggered backward, clutching her head. The memories felt too real, too vivid. as if her family was standing right behind her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the visions, but they only grew stronger. The urge to let go, to surrender, was almost overwhelming. "No!" she screamed, driving the crowbar into the creature's chest. It let out a piercing shriek, the sound reverberating through the mall like a shockwave. Hannah stumbled, her ears ringing as the figure crumpled to the ground, its body convulsing before dissolving into ash. The static didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent. The walls of the mall began to tremble, cracks spiderwebbing through the ceiling. Hannah ran, her flashlight bobbing wildly as she sprinted back the way she came. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The voice was there, burrowing deeper into her mind. She dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone," she sobbed. The whisper grew quieter, almost gentle. "It's not so bad. You'll see." Hannah didn't know how long she sat there, rocking back and forth as the sun set behind the skeletal remains of the city. When she finally opened her eyes, the world seemed darker, the edges of reality blurred. She stood on shaky legs, the crowbar hanging limply at her side. The murmur was still there, always there. But for now, she kept walking. And somewhere, deep within her mind, a part of her began to wonder if it was right. Even the strongest will can crumble beneath the weight of a whisper. The apocalypse didn't come with a warning. There were no blaring sirens, no fiery meteors streaking across the sky. Instead, it arrived quietly, like a shadow slipping beneath a closed door. The sun dimmed one afternoon, just enough for people to notice. Then it dimmed again the next day. By the end of the week, it was as though someone had pulled a curtain over the earth. The darkness didn't kill people outright. It just brought something else with it. Emma sat in the remnants of an old farmhouse, the cold seeping through the broken windows. The candles she'd lit were nearly burned down to the stubs, their faint glow casting trembling shadows on the cracked walls. She gripped her makeshift spear, a broom handle with a sharpened kitchen knife duct-taped to the end. It wasn't much, but it had kept her alive so far. Outside, the night stretched endlessly. It had been over a year since the world had plunged into darkness, and Emma had forgotten what a blue sky looked like. She wasn't even sure what month it was anymore. All she knew was survival, and that the things in the dark were always watching. The creatures had come with the fading light. No one knew where they came from, but they were relentless, hunting anything that made noise or showed light. Emma had learned quickly. Keep quiet, keep hidden, keep the lights low. At first, humanity had tried to fight back. Armed patrols with floodlights and flamethrowers swept through the streets. Cities barricaded themselves with walls of metal and concrete. But the creatures didn't just kill, they changed things. People, animals, even the buildings themselves seemed to warp and crumble in their presence. Emma had been living in the farmhouse for 2 weeks, moving only when her supplies ran out. She had survived by staying silent, avoiding the roads, and scavenging from ruins that others had long abandoned. But tonight, something felt different. The air was heavier, colder. The shadows in the room seemed darker, shifting when she wasn't looking. She heard it first, a faint clicking sound like claws on stone. Her body tensed, her knuckles white as she gripped the spear. The clicking grew louder, moving closer. Emma blew out the candles, plunging the room into darkness. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she crouched behind an overturned table, her breath shallow. The farmhouse was supposed to be safe. The creatures rarely ventured this far into rural areas, but nothing about the world made sense anymore. The clicking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Emma clenched her teeth, her muscles coiled like springs. She didn't dare look. She didn't dare breathe. A scratching sound came from the window. Slowly, agonizingly, Emma turned her head. A pale, elongated hand pressed against the glass. The creatures were humanoid, but only barely. Their skin was translucent, stretched too tightly over long, angular bones. They had no eyes, just hollow sockets that oozed a faint black mist. Their mouths, however, were all too functional, filled with jagged teeth and capable of unholy sounds that drove people mad. The hand tapped against the glass once, twice. Then it pressed harder, the pain creaking under the pressure. Emma tightened her grip on the spear, her mind racing. If it came inside, she was dead. Suddenly the creature froze. its head tilted unnaturally as if listening. Emma strained her ears but heard nothing. The hand slid down the glass, leaving a smear of that black mist behind, and the creature vanished into the darkness. She didn't move for hours. When dawn, or what passed for dawn in this eternal twilight, finally arrived, Emma ventured outside. The air was crisp, the frost on the ground crunching under her boots. She scanned the horizon, her breath visible in the pale, weak light. In the distance the woods loomed, their shadows deep and uninviting. She hated the woods. The creatures were more active there, using the tangled branches and dense undergrowth to hide. But the farmhouse was emptying of supplies, and the nearest town was days away on foot. She tightened her coat around herself, her resolve hardening. She needed food, water, and batteries for her flashlight. Staying here meant starving to death, and she wasn't ready to die. Not yet. The forest was unnervingly quiet as she moved through it, her spear held at the ready. Twigs snapped underfoot, and every sound seemed to echo far louder than it should. The air smelled damp and earthy, but there was an underlying metallic tang she couldn't ignore. As she reached a small clearing, Emma spotted what looked like a campsite. A tent, partially collapsed, sat in the middle, surrounded by scattered belongings. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the shadows for movement. The campsite had been abandoned in a hurry. A backpack lay open, its contents spilling out. A few cans of food, a flashlight, and a small journal. Emma grabbed the food and flashlight, then hesitated. The journal was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. She tucked it into her coat. That was when she heard the sound. A whisper, soft and unintelligible, like wind through dry leaves. Her stomach turned to ice. She spun around, her eyes darting between the trees. There was nothing there, but the whispering grew louder. She ran. Branches clawed at her face and arms as she tore through the woods, the whispers now a cacophony in her ears. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the forest, her chest heaving and her legs trembling. Only then did she dare to look back. The woods were still, silent, but she knew they were watching. Back at the farmhouse, Emma sat by the cold hearth, clutching the journal. Her hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was messy, frantic. It detailed the writer's encounters with the creatures, their movements, their weaknesses, or lack thereof. One passage caught her eye. The darkness isn't natural, it's alive. It feeds on fear, on noise, on light. The creatures are its hands, its teeth, but the core, the heart of it, is somewhere else. I've seen it, a black tower on the horizon. It calls to them, it calls to me. Emma's blood ran cold. She had seen the tower too, in the distance beyond the woods, a jagged silhouette piercing the dim sky. She had dismissed it as a broken structure, a relic of the old world, but now she wasn't so sure. The next morning, she packed her belongings. She couldn't stay in the farmhouse any longer. The creatures knew she was there, and the supplies wouldn't last. Her destination was clear, the tower. If the journal was right, it might hold the key to stopping the creatures, to ending the darkness, or it might kill her. Either way, she had nothing left to lose. The journey to the tower took days. The creatures hunted her relentlessly, their whispers always close. She fought when she had to, hiding when she could. The closer she got, the darker the world became, until even the weak daylight disappeared. When she finally reached the base of the tower, Emma was barely standing. The structure loomed above her, its surface pulsing with veins of black light. The air around it was thick, almost suffocating. She stepped inside. The tower's interior was a labyrinth of twisting corridors and impossible angles. The walls seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, and the whispers grew louder with every step. At its center, she found a massive, pulsating orb of darkness, suspended in the air. The core, it radiated malice, an ancient hunger that made her skin crawl. Emma gripped her spear and approached. The whispers became screams, the shadows coalescing into forms that lunged at her from all sides. With a cry, she drove the spear into the core. The tower trembled, the darkness writhing and recoiling. Light, blinding, brilliant light, burst from the wound, consuming everything. When Emma opened her eyes, the sky was blue. The creatures were gone, the world eerily silent. Emma stood alone in the ruins of the tower, the sun warm on her face. She didn't know if she had truly won or if this was just the beginning, but for the first time in a long while there was hope. The apocalypse didn't come with fire or ice, it came with the sound of an old radio crackling to life. No one knew where the signal originated, it just appeared, broadcasting across every frequency, playing a haunting melody that seemed to worm its way into your soul. The music wasn't the worst part, it was the voice that followed, a gentle, hypnotic whisper that spoke of a new world, one free of pain, struggle, and fear. And all you had to do was listen. Jake adjusted the straps of his gas mask as he stepped through the crumbling remnants of what used to be downtown Chicago. The air was thick with dust, a faint haze that muted the sunlight and coated everything in a greyish film. The streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of a collapsing building or the distant howl of wind. 3 months. That's how long it had been since the signal began. 3 months since the cities emptied, leaving only the ash and whispers behind. The survivors, if there were any left, were scattered, silent ghosts wandering the ruins, each one trying to resist the call of the voice. Jake had lost his wife and daughter in the first wave. They hadn't been taken by disease or violence, but by the allure of the melody. One morning, he woke to find them standing in the yard, staring at the sky as the radio hummed its tune from the living room. Their faces were serene, almost blissful, as they dissolved into dust. He'd smashed the radio, but it was too late. The signal was everywhere. Jake crouched in the shadow of a gutted car, scanning the street ahead. A figure shuffled across the intersection, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was one of them. The Echoed were once human. Now they were something else. The voice had left its mark on them, twisting their bodies and hollowing their minds. Their flesh was cracked and grey, as if they'd been scorched from the inside out, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Jake gripped the handle of his crowbar, holding his breath as the creature sniffed the air, its head twitching toward his direction. He'd learned early on that the Echoed didn't rely on sight. They hunted by sound and smell, drawn to the faintest hint of life. The figure let out a low, guttural moan before shuffling away, its broken form disappearing into the fog. Jake exhaled slowly and continued toward his destination. He was heading to the source. For weeks he'd been piecing together scraps of information from old radios and notes scrawled by other survivors. Every message pointed to the same place, a broadcast tower just outside the city. It was where the signal had first been detected, where the whispers were strongest. Jake didn't know what he'd find there, but he couldn't ignore it. If there was even a chance he could stop the signal, he had to try. The streets narrowed as he approached the edge of downtown, the buildings looming closer together like skeletal sentinels. The tower rose in the distance, its silhouette faintly visible through the haze. A cold knot formed in his stomach as the faint hum of the signal began to creep into his ears. The closer he got, the louder it became. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a weight pressing against his chest, a pull in the back of his mind. He clenched his fists, focusing on the crunch of his boots against the ash-covered pavement. "Jake." The voice was soft, familiar. He froze, his heart pounding. "Jake, it's me. Come back to us." He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the empty street. There was no one there. "It's okay now," the voice continued, so sweet and soothing it made his throat tighten. It was his daughter's voice. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Jake shut his eyes, shaking his head. "You're not real," he muttered through gritted teeth. "You're not real." The voice faded, replaced by the faint melody of the signal, now louder than before. He forced himself forward, his every step feeling heavier, as if the earth itself was trying to pull him back. The base of the tower was surrounded by debris, twisted metal, shattered glass, and bones half buried in ash. A faint glow emanated from the structure, casting eerie shadows across the ruins. Jake approached cautiously, the hum of the signal now a deafening roar in his ears. His thoughts felt sluggish, his grip on reality slipping with every step. He clung to the memory of his wife and daughter, using their faces to anchor himself. The entrance to the tower was ajar, its rusted door hanging crookedly on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick and stifling, the glow from the tower casting the walls in an unnatural light. As he ascended the stairs, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping and intertwining. Some were pleading, others laughing, but all of them spoke directly to him. "You're so close," one voice said. "Just let go." "Join us," another urged. "We're waiting for you." Jake clenched his jaw, forcing his legs to keep moving. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling upward into the glowing heart of the tower. At the top, he found the source. The room was filled with ancient machinery, its surfaces coated in the same black, tar-like substance that seemed to pulse with life. At the center of the room was the transmitter, a massive humming device that radiated a sickly green light, and standing beside it was a figure. It looked human at first glance, but as Jake stepped closer, he saw the truth. Its skin was translucent, its veins glowing with the same light as the transmitter. Its face was smooth, featureless, save for a mouth that stretched too wide when it spoke. "You came," it said, its voice a perfect imitation of his wife's. "I knew you would." Jake raised his crowbar, his hands trembling. "What are you?" The figure tilted its head, the light in its veins pulsing rhythmically. "I am the signal. I am the voice that calls to you, and you." It stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "You are mine." Jake lunged, swinging the crowbar with all his strength. The figure moved impossibly fast, its hand catching the weapon mid-swing. It leaned in, its smooth face inches from his own. "Why fight?" it whispered. "Haven't you suffered enough? Let me take it away. Let me bring you peace." For a moment, Jake hesitated. The weight of his grief, his loneliness, pressed down on him like a physical force. The figure's touch was cold but not unpleasant, and the whispers in his mind promised an end to the pain. But then he saw their faces, his wife, his daughter, and he remembered the ash. With a roar, he wrenched the crowbar free and swung again, this time striking the transmitter. Sparks flew as the machine screamed, its hum turning into a piercing wail. The figure shrieked, its form flickering like a dying flame. Jake didn't stop. He struck the transmitter again and again, the room shaking with each blow. The light dimmed, the whispers fading until there was only silence. When it was over, Jake stumbled out of the tower, the dawn breaking over the ruined city. The air felt lighter, the haze beginning to lift. For the first time in months, the signal was gone. He sank to his knees, staring at the horizon. The world was still broken, but it was quiet. And for Jake, that was enough, for now. The world didn't end with a bang. It wasn't a meteor or nuclear war. It came as a whisper, soft at first, then roaring like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. People called it the hollowing. It began innocuously, just a strange wind in the middle of July, hot and dry, with a faint metallic tang. Scientists couldn't explain it, brushing off the phenomenon as unusual weather patterns, but it didn't go away. By August, crops began dying, livestock fell sick, and birds fell out of the sky mid-flight. September brought chaos. Cities descended into madness as power grids failed. Governments toppled one after another. Reports of mass disappearances became the norm. People claimed that something unseen was stalking the streets at night, dragging the screaming into shadows. And then, the world went quiet. 6 months later, the girl woke to the sound of silence. Even the insects had abandoned this part of the world. Charlotte, Charlie to anyone left to call her that, was alone in the ruins of New Dallas, where glass towers now stood as skeletal reminders of what once was. Her food was running low. Yesterday she'd eaten the last of her canned peaches. She knew it was dangerous to venture out, but hunger gnawed at her. The creatures came at night, but daytime was no guarantee of safety. She tied her boots tightly and slung her father's rifle across her back. The gun wasn't loaded. She hadn't seen bullets in months, but the weight of it gave her courage. The streets were a graveyard. Burned-out cars, their frames rusted, lined the roads like forgotten corpses. Charlie passed a small grocery store, its glass doors shattered. She didn't dare step inside. The last time she scavenged in a place like that, she'd heard something moving in the dark aisles. Instead, she headed for the outskirts. There was an old suburban neighborhood, largely untouched by the fires that had consumed the city. If she was lucky, she might find something edible in one of the abandoned houses. The shadow in the basement. Charlie found the house at the end of the block. It was small, unassuming, with peeling white paint and a sagging roof. The front door hung ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and rot. She stepped cautiously, her boots crunching on shattered glass. The living room was a mess of overturned furniture and broken picture frames. She moved to the kitchen, opening cupboards and drawers. Nothing. The fridge held only the stench of decay. Her stomach growled, a painful reminder of her desperation. There was one more place to check, the basement. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring into the inky blackness below. Something about the darkness felt alive, but she couldn't afford fear. Clutching the flashlight she'd found weeks ago, she descended the creaking stairs. The beam of light cut through the gloom, revealing shelves lined with jars. Hope surged in her chest. Food. She rushed to the nearest shelf and grabbed a jar. It was filled with peaches preserved in syrup. The label was faded, but she didn't care. Her fingers fumbled to open it. That's when she heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from the far corner of the room. The flashlight trembled in her hand as she turned it toward the noise. The beam caught something glinting in the dark. Eyes. 2, then 4, then 6. They blinked in unison, reflecting the light like mirrors. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Stupid! Why did she say anything? The growling stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then a scuttling sound, fast and sharp like claws on concrete. The eyes disappeared. Charlie didn't wait to see where they went. She grabbed the jar of peaches and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She didn't stop running until she was back in the street. The lonely road. The next day, Charlie decided to leave New Dallas. There was nothing left for her here. She'd heard rumors of a settlement to the north past the Red River. It might be nothing, just another lie spread by desperate survivors, but she had to try. The journey was grueling. The sun was relentless, beating down on her as she walked the cracked highway. Each night, she slept in the ruins of old motels, barricading the doors with whatever she could find. The creatures were out there. She could hear them sometimes, skittering in the shadows, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. One night, she woke to the sound of scratching at the window. Her heart pounded as she stared at the glass, fogged by her breath. A shadow passed by, too large to be human. She held her breath, clutching the rifle like a talisman. The scratching stopped, but she didn't sleep again that night. The end of the world. On the 5th day, Charlie reached the Red River, or what was left of it. The water had turned black, thick like tar, and it reeked of sulphur. A rusted bridge stretched across it, barely holding itself together. She hesitated before stepping onto it, the metal groaning under her weight. Halfway across, she saw them. On the far side of the river, a group of figures stood motionless. At first, she thought they were human, but as she drew closer, she realized their limbs were too long, their heads too misshapen. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their mouths were filled with needle-like teeth. They turned to her in unison, as if sensing her presence. She froze, her heart racing. Then, one of them let out a piercing shriek, and they began to move toward her, fast and fluid like predators. Charlie ran. The bridge shuddered beneath her as she sprinted back the way she came. The creatures were gaining on her. She could hear their footsteps, their snarls. Just as she reached the end of the bridge, she tripped, falling hard onto the concrete. She rolled onto her back, clutching the rifle as the first creature leaped toward her. She swung the weapon like a club, striking it across the face. It let out a screech, recoiling. The others hesitated, their black eyes watching her. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not stopping until she was deep into the woods. Hope in the ashes. Charlie didn't know how long she ran. By the time she stopped, her legs felt like jelly and her lungs burned. She collapsed against a tree, tears streaming down her face. She was going to die out here, alone and forgotten. Then she heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Hey, over here!" She looked up, her vision blurry. A group of people stood in the distance, waving to her. They were armed, their faces weathered but alive. Relief flooded her as she stumbled toward them. "Welcome to Haven," one of them said, extending a hand. "You're safe now." For the first time in months, Charlie allowed herself to hope. But as she glanced back toward the dark woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures were still watching, waiting, because the world wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to them. The world ended with a sound. Not an explosion, not a scream, just a low, steady hum that rose from the depths of the earth and spread across every corner of the globe. It seeped through the cracks of humanity's daily lives, coming through radios, televisions, and even unpowered speakers. At first, people dismissed it as interference, a harmless anomaly. Then the disappearances began. By the time scientists scrambled to understand the phenomenon, it was too late. The hum had become a melody, an eerie, hypnotic tune that no one could resist. Those who listened too long simply walked away, leaving behind their homes, their families, and their lives. They vanished into the shadows, drawn to something no one could explain. Now, the world was empty. Almost. Logan adjusted the dials on the battered shortwave radio, his fingers trembling. The static-filled silence of the abandoned bunker pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional creak of the earth settling above. He paused, holding his breath as the faint sound of a voice crackled through the speaker. "If you can hear this, safe zone, coordinates..." The transmission cut out, replaced by the hum. Logan quickly turned the volume down, sweat beading on his forehead. The hum was soft, barely audible, but he could feel it. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence, a thing that seemed to press against his mind, whispering promises of peace and rest. "Not today," he muttered, shaking his head to clear it. The voice had mentioned a safe zone. He hadn't heard another human voice in months, and the thought of finding other survivors was enough to push him forward. He grabbed his backpack, his shotgun, and the map he'd pieced together from scraps scavenged in the ruins. The coordinates were far, across what used to be a bustling city, now a graveyard of steel and concrete. The surface was worse than he remembered. The sky was a dull, oppressive grey, the sun a faint smudge behind the thick clouds. The air was heavy, carrying the metallic tang of decay. Buildings leaned at unnatural angles, their windows dark and empty. Vehicles lay abandoned, their frames doors rusting and twisted. Logan moved cautiously, his boots crunching on the broken pavement. He had learned the hard way that the hum wasn't the only thing to fear. The creatures, things that had once been human but were now something else, roamed the streets. They didn't see or hear like normal animals. They hunted through vibrations, drawn to movement and sound. He froze as a shadow flickered in the corner of his vision. A figure emerged from the ruins, its elongated limbs jerking unnaturally as it moved. Its face was a mask of grey flesh, eyeless, with a mouth stretched into a permanent toothy grin. Logan gripped his shotgun, keeping still as the creature sniffed the air. The hum grew louder. The creatures were linked to it. Logan was sure of that. They appeared shortly after the melody began, emerging from the same places where people had vanished. Some survivors claimed the creatures were the missing, transformed by whatever force the sound carried. Logan didn't care. All he knew was that they were deadly. The creature tilted its head, the grin seeming to widen as it stepped closer. Logan slowly reached for the small can of screws he kept in his pocket. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it down the alleyway. The metallic rattle echoed through the ruins, and the creature snapped toward the sound, lurching after it with terrifying speed. Logan didn't wait to see if it would come back. He slipped through a shattered storefront, his heart hammering in his chest. By nightfall, Logan had made it halfway to the coordinates. He found shelter in an abandoned subway station, the tunnels offering a brief reprieve from the open streets. The hum was softer underground, but it was never truly gone. He lit a small fire, using scraps of wood from broken benches. The warmth was comforting, even if it made him uneasy to produce light. He unpacked a can of beans, eating quickly as his eyes scanned the shadows. The map lay open beside him, and his eyes lingered on the circled coordinates. The voice on the radio had sounded calm, confident. Whoever they were, they hadn't been overtaken by the hum, or the creatures. Maybe they had found a way to fight back. As he drifted off to sleep, the melody slipped into his dreams. It wasn't chaotic or dissonant. It was beautiful, alluring. He dreamed of a vast black tower rising from the earth, its spire piercing the clouds. Around it, figures danced in the darkness, their bodies glowing faintly. The melody was coming from the tower, calling to him. When Logan woke, he wasn't sure if the dream had been his own. The next day, the journey became more treacherous. The hum grew stronger the closer he got to the coordinates, vibrating through his bones. The creatures were more numerous, their movements more erratic. Logan avoided them as best he could, using every ounce of stealth he'd learned since the world fell apart. By the time he reached the outskirts of the safe zone, he was exhausted. The location was an old industrial complex, its towering smokestack silhouetted against the grey sky. The hum here was deafening, a constant pressure that made his vision blur. He spotted movement near one of the buildings, a flash of colour, a figure darting inside. Logan's heart leapt. He wasn't alone. The interior of the complex was a maze of rusted machinery and crumbling walls. The hum seemed to pulse here, as if the building itself were alive. Logan followed faint footprints in the dust, his shotgun raised. "Hello?" he called softly, his voice hoarse. A shape stepped out from the shadows, a woman, thin and pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She held a pistol, its barrel trembling as she aimed it at him. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Logan," he said, lowering his shotgun slightly. "I heard the broadcast. I'm here for the safe zone." The woman laughed bitterly. "Safe zone? There's no safe zone, just more lies to bring people here." Logan frowned. The voice on the radio. "It's the hum," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "It learns. It mimics. It called you, didn't it?" Before Logan could respond, the building shook, a low rumble reverberating through the walls. The hum intensified, and the woman's expression twisted with fear. "They're here," she whispered. The creatures poured into the building, their grins glowing faintly in the dim light. Logan fired, the shotgun's roar cutting through the oppressive sound. One creature collapsed, but more took its place, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they crawled over the machinery. The woman grabbed his arm. "This way." They ran deeper into the complex, the creatures close behind. The hum was overwhelming now, a deafening cacophony that made it hard to think. They burst into a massive chamber dominated by a strange, pulsating machine at its center. The woman pointed to it. "That's the source!" Logan hesitated. The machine was mesmerizing, its surface shifting like liquid light. The melody emanating from it was beautiful, almost soothing. For a moment, he wanted to step closer, to touch it. "Destroy it!" the woman screamed, snapping him out of the trance. Logan raised his shotgun and fired. The machine screeched, sparks flying as its surface cracked. The hum wavered, the creatures recoiling. He fired again, and the melody fractured, breaking into jagged, discordant notes. The creatures let out a collective wail before collapsing into ash. The machine shuddered violently, then exploded in a burst of blinding light. When the dust settled, the hum was gone. The air was still, the silence almost unbearable after months of constant noise. Logan and the woman emerged from the ruins, the sky above them brighter than it had been in a year. "Do you think it's over?" Logan asked. The woman didn't answer. She stared at the horizon, where a faint dark spire loomed in the distance. Not yet. The world died long before the cities fell silent. Before the skies turned grey and the earth cracked underfoot, humanity had already lost itself in a tangle of endless progress and blind ambition. Then came the signal. No one knew where it came from or why it started. It just appeared, humming in the background of radios, TVs, even unpowered speakers. At first, people thought it was a glitch. Then, it started speaking. Samantha adjusted the straps of her backpack as she climbed the rusted ladder leading to the top of an abandoned train station. The cold wind whipped her face, carrying the faint scent of decay. She tightened her grip on her knife, every nerve in her body on high alert. This part of the city used to be a bustling transit hub. Now it was a wasteland of shattered glass and twisted steel. The once proud clock tower that loomed above the station was crumbling, its face frozen at 2:34, the moment the world stopped. Samantha had been searching for weeks, following fragmented messages scrawled on walls and etched into the dirt by other survivors. Go to the station. She didn't know who left them, or why, but it was her only lead in a world that had gone quiet. The hum of the signal was faint here, barely noticeable. That should have made her feel safer, but it didn't. She knew the silence wouldn't last. The signal had started as a low-frequency hum, barely distinguishable from static. Then, over time, it became something else. Words, phrases, songs sung in languages no one could identify. Scientists and governments scrambled to understand it, but before they could, people began to change. It didn't happen all at once. First, they stopped talking. Then, they stopped moving. Entire families were found standing in their living rooms, staring blankly at walls, their bodies slowly withering into statues of ash. Those who tried to interrupt them, pull them back, shake them awake, often joined them. The ash statues crumbled when touched, leaving behind nothing but piles of dust. The survivors who avoided the signal's pull said the same thing. They heard something, a voice. It was different for everyone. A loved one, a childhood memory, a secret hope. Whatever it was, it promised comfort, answers, peace. Samantha didn't believe in peace anymore. The train station was vast and empty, its tracks stretching into the darkness. Samantha crept along the platform, her flashlight sweeping across graffiti-covered walls and abandoned luggage. She could hear the faint rustle of something moving, but she didn't dare call out. The rules were simple now. Don't make noise, don't follow the signal, and don't trust anyone who smiled. The last one was important. Samantha had seen it before, survivors who claimed they were immune to the signal. They'd offer food, shelter, companionship. Then, in the dead of night, they'd start whispering, their smiles too wide and their eyes too empty. She never stayed long enough to see what happened next. She found a staircase leading down into the station's lower levels. The air grew colder as she descended, the sound of her boots echoing off the damp walls. The signal was stronger here, a low vibration she could feel in her chest. Her head throbbed, and she clenched her teeth against the faint whispers at the edge of her hearing. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a cavernous room filled with trains frozen in place. Their windows were dark, their interiors eerily pristine, as if they'd been abandoned mid-journey. Samantha's flashlight flickered, and she cursed under her breath, smacking it until the light steadied. "Hello?" The voice was soft, trembling, and human. Samantha whipped around, her knife at the ready. A girl no older than 16 stood a few feet away. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn, but her eyes were clear. No empty stare, no hollow smile. "Who are you?" Samantha demanded, keeping her distance. "Clara," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been hiding down here. Are you here to fix it?" "Fix what?" Samantha asked, her knife still raised. "The signal," Clara said. Her gaze flicked to the far end of the room, where a door marked maintenance stood slightly ajar. "It's coming from down there. I think it's alive." Samantha didn't trust the girl, but she couldn't ignore what she'd said. If the source of the signal was here, she had to see it for herself. Maybe there was a way to end this nightmare. The two of them moved cautiously toward the maintenance door. Samantha kept the girl in her peripheral vision, ready to react if this turned out to be a trap. The signal was louder now, a rhythmic pulse that made her teeth ache. Inside, the maintenance room was a maze of pipes, wires, and machinery, all coated in a slick black substance that oozed from the walls. At the center of the room was a massive console, its screens glowing faintly. The hum of the signal was deafening here, and Samantha's head throbbed with every beat. Clara stopped abruptly, her eyes wide with terror. "Do you see it?" she whispered. Samantha followed her gaze to the console. Something was moving beneath the black ooze, its form shifting and undulating like a living shadow. It pulsed in time with the signal, its surface covered in faint glowing symbols that hurt to look at. What is that?" Samantha asked, her voice barely audible. "I think it's calling us," Clara said, her voice trembling. "It wants us to join it." The whispers were louder now, distinct and piercing. They weren't just in the air, they were in Samantha's mind. Her mother's voice, warm and soothing, calling her name, promising safety, peace, an end to the fear. "No," Samantha growled, clutching her head. She stumbled toward the console, her knife shaking in her hand. The thing beneath the ooze writhed, its whispers growing more insistent. "You can't fight it," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "It's too strong." "I don't care," Samantha snapped. She raised the knife and drove it into the console. Sparks flew as the machine let out a piercing screech, the black ooze splattering across the room. The whispers turned to screams, and the signal's pulse became erratic like a dying heartbeat. The ground trembled and the walls began to crack. Samantha grabbed Clara's arm, dragging her toward the exit as the room collapsed around them. The last thing she saw was the creature beneath the console writhing in agony. its glowing symbols fading into darkness. They emerged into the cold night air, coughing and covered in ash. The signal was gone, the oppressive hum replaced by an eerie, empty silence. For the first time in months, Samantha felt like she could breathe. "Did we stop it?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. Samantha didn't answer. She looked up at the sky where faint lights shimmered, like stars blinking back to life. But deep down, she knew the fight wasn't over. The signal might be gone, but the scars it left behind would never fade, and somewhere in the vast emptiness of the world, it was waiting to return, because some things never truly die. The apocalypse didn't come as fire raining from the sky or a flood washing away cities. It came as a whisper, a soft, insidious murmur that spread like a disease. By the time humanity realized what was happening, it was too late. The whisper began one ordinary night. It wasn't loud or startling, but it was everywhere. On radios, through televisions, over phone lines. Even those sitting in complete silence swore they heard it, like someone breathing just behind them. Scientists called it the signal. Conspiracy theorists had their own names. The voice of the void, the God wave. Whatever it was, it didn't stop. By the end of the first week, people had started disappearing. Nate crouched low behind an overturned truck, his breath visible in the freezing night air. The city around him was a graveyard of cracked pavement and skeletal buildings, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets. Dust clung to everything, shrouding the ruins in an endless grey. He had been running for hours, his legs burned, his throat raw from the effort. But he couldn't stop, not with the wail still echoing somewhere behind him. The creatures hunted by sound, drawn to the faintest noise, a cough, a footstep, even the intake of breath. Nate had seen what happened to those they caught. The memory of his sister's scream as they dragged her into the shadows haunted him every time he closed his eyes. A faint hum thrummed through the air, a sound that wasn't quite a noise but more a feeling, pressing against the back of his skull. Nate clutched the battered radio strapped to his backpack. It was dead, the batteries long gone, but the signal didn't care. It wormed its way through every device, even those that shouldn't have worked. He glanced over the truck's edge. The street ahead was empty, its once busy storefronts reduced to blackened husks. But that didn't mean it was safe. He adjusted the grip on his crowbar and stepped into the open, every movement deliberate and silent. The signal wasn't strong here. He could barely feel it. That meant there was still time. The collapse had been fast, far faster than anyone expected. People who listened to the whisper too long stopped being themselves. At first, they seemed normal, calmer, quieter. Then came the smiles, the eerie, vacant expressions that never faltered. Finally, they simply walked away, vanishing into the horizon. Some said they dissolved into the air, their bodies unraveling into threads of light. Others claimed they joined the wailing creatures, becoming part of the endless hunt. The truth didn't matter. They were gone. The survivors learned to live without sound. Conversations became whispers, then hand signals. Cities emptied as people fled to remote areas, hoping to escape the reach of the signal. But no matter where you went, it always found you. Nate reached the edge of a plaza, its centerpiece a rusted fountain clogged with ash. He froze. Something moved on the far side, a flicker of shadow, too fluid to be human. His chest tightened as he crouched low, pressing his back against the fountain's rim. The hum was louder now, vibrating in his teeth. He gripped the crowbar tighter, his knuckles white. If it found him, he had one chance. The creatures weren't invincible, but killing one was loud, and loud meant death. The shadow appeared again, closer this time. It slithered into view, its form shifting like smoke caught in a draft. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a vaguely humanoid outline that pulsed with faint light. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting the ruins behind it. Nate's breath hitched as the creature paused, its head tilting unnaturally, as if listening. The hum grew deafening, filling his skull with static. He bit down on the sleeve of his jacket, muffling the involuntary whimper that escaped his throat. The creature snapped toward the sound, moving with inhuman speed. Nate didn't think. He swung the crowbar with all his strength. The metal struck the creature's torso, and it let out a piercing shriek that split the air like a siren. Damn it, he hissed, already running. The plaza erupted in noise as more creatures emerged from the shadows, their wails harmonizing into a chorus of pain. Nate sprinted down an alley, his heart pounding. He didn't dare look back. The hum was everywhere now, rattling the loose fillings in his teeth. The radio in his backpack crackled to life, the dead static replaced by a familiar voice. Nate. He stumbled, nearly losing his footing. The voice was clear, warm, and impossibly real. Nate, it's me. You can stop running now. It was his sister. No, he muttered, shaking his head. You're not real. The voice softened, tinged with sadness. Don't be scared, I'm here. You don't have to do this alone. Nate forced himself to keep moving, his legs screaming in protest. The creatures were closing in, their wails deafening, but the voice was worse. It pressed against his mind, peeling away the edges of his sanity. Ahead, a faint light flickered through the haze. He didn't know what it was. A campfire, a flare, maybe just the remnants of a building still smouldering, but it was his only hope. He burst into an open courtyard, the light revealing a small group of survivors huddled around a makeshift barricade. Their faces were pale and hollow, but their eyes widened as Nate stumbled toward them. "Help!" he gasped, collapsing against the barricade. "They're coming!" The group scrambled, pulling him over the barrier just as the creatures flooded into the courtyard. The wails grew unbearable, shaking the very ground. One of the survivors, a woman with cropped hair and a scar running down her cheek, grabbed a device from her pack. It looked like an old radio, modified with wires and glowing tubes. She flipped a switch and the air vibrated with a deep, resonant tone. The creatures froze, their forms flickering like dying flames. One by one they collapsed, dissolving into ash. Nate stared, his chest heaving. What was that? The woman didn't answer immediately, her hands trembling as she powered down the device. "A weapon," she said finally. "One of the last." The survivors led Nate to their shelter, a hidden bunker beneath the ruins. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and damp concrete. The walls were lined with old equipment, much of it scavenged from military installations. The woman introduced herself as Leah. She explained that the device was part of an experimental project designed to counteract the signal. It didn't kill the creatures, not permanently, but it drove them back. "There's a facility," Leah said, her voice low, "where the signal began. If we can reach it, we can stop this." Nate stared at her, disbelief warring with hope. "You think we can end this?" Leah's eyes were hard. "We have to try." The journey to the facility was brutal. The signal grew stronger with every mile, its whispers more insistent. The group dwindled, picked off one by one until only Nate and Leah remained. When they finally reached the facility, it was nothing like Nate expected. The structure was massive, its walls covered in pulsating veins of light. At its center was a machine, its surface shifting like liquid metal. Leah activated the device, and the air erupted in a violent hum. The machine shuddered, its light flickering erratically. The whispers turned to screams, and the ground trembled as the facility began to collapse. Nate and Leah ran, the wails of the creatures chasing them into the dawn. When it was over, the signal was gone. The hum had stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt oppressive. The sky, still grey, seemed lighter somehow. Nate stood in the ruins, the weight of what they'd done settling over him. The world was still broken, but for the first time in months there was hope, and sometimes that was enough. The apocalypse didn't come with warning sirens or fire raining from the heavens. It came with a shift in the air, a sensation that something vital had been unhooked from reality. It began one morning when the sky froze. Clouds ceased to drift, birds stopped mid-flight, and even the sun hung in place like a broken clock. At first, people marveled at the eerie stillness, thinking it a natural anomaly. By nightfall, the terror began. The tethered arrived. Lena adjusted the straps of her oxygen mask, her breath hissing as the filter strained against the dust-filled air. The old subway station where she hid reeked of mildew and rotting iron. She clenched her crowbar tightly, its weight grounding her. Above her, faint vibrations rattled the metal framework, a rhythmic thrum she knew too well. The tethered were hunting again. They were the reason no one dared to stay above ground. When the sky froze, they descended, their blackened, spindly forms stretching impossibly tall. At first, they ignored humans entirely, wandering aimlessly and whispering sounds no one could decipher. But then, people began disappearing, pulled into the air by unseen forces, their screams cutting off in terrifying silence, and those who came back were no longer human. Lena ducked behind a rusted turnstile as faint footsteps echoed through the subway tunnel. She strained her ears, listening for the telltale clicking sound of their joints. Nothing yet. She risked a glance down the tunnel. A dim light flickered in the distance. Another survivor's signal, perhaps. She hesitated. Survivors were rare these days, and most who remained weren't trustworthy. But the alternative, staying alone, was worse. Clutching her crowbar, Lena crept along the wall, her boots scraping softly against the cracked tiles. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing a makeshift camp tucked into the side of the tunnel. Cans of food were stacked haphazardly, and a small generator buzzed faintly beside a portable lantern. A man crouched nearby, his back to her, hunched over something she couldn't see. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice muffled by the mask. The man turned sharply, his eyes wide and bloodshot. His face was pale, gaunt and streaked with grime, but he looked alive, human. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, glancing nervously down the tunnel. "They'll come." "Who are you?" Lena asked, keeping her distance. "Ethan," he said, standing slowly. He held a jagged piece of rebar in one hand, but he didn't raise it. "What do you want?" "Just passing through," she replied. "The tunnels aren't safe, you know that." Ethan gave a hollow laugh. "Nowhere's safe." They sat by the flickering lantern, sharing a can of beans Ethan insisted was still edible. He spoke in bursts, his words disjointed, like he hadn't had a real conversation in weeks. "They're not from here," he said, staring at the ground. "They're tethered. I think they're part of the sky now, anchored to it." Lena frowned. "What do you mean?" "When the sky froze, something broke. The tether snapped and they fell. But they're trying to fix it." His voice dropped to a whisper. "They're using us." The thought sent a chill down her spine. She'd seen the aftermath of their work. Humans suspended in mid-air, limbs twisted unnaturally, their bodies stitched with threads of light. The tethered never killed outright. They changed you, bent you to their will. Ethan leaned closer. "I'm heading to the core." "The core?" Lena asked, startled. "The old observatory on the edge of the city. That's where it started. The freeze, the sky, all of it." His voice trembled with urgency. "If we can find the source, we can stop them." Lena wanted to refuse, to leave Ethan behind and continue surviving on her own. But his words stuck with her. The observatory. She'd heard rumors before, whispered by dying survivors or scribbled on walls. A single place where the tethered were most concentrated. A place where answers might lie. Against her better judgment, she agreed. The journey through the tunnels was harrowing. The deeper they went, the stronger the vibrations became, the faint whispers of the tethered echoing through the darkness. Lena kept her crowbar at the ready, her heart pounding with every step. They passed through abandoned stations and collapsed passageways, navigating by the dim glow of Ethan's lantern. At one point, they found a trail of ash leading to a pile of discarded clothing. Ethan refused to stop, muttering about how the tethered shed what they no longer needed. By the time they emerged above ground, the city was unrecognizable. Buildings jutted at strange angles, their walls warped as though reality itself had begun to sag. The air was heavy, thick with a metallic taste that clung to the back of Lena's throat. Ahead, the observatory loomed like a wound in the skyline. Its dome was cracked, leaking a faint blue light that pulsed rhythmically. The tethered drifted around it, their elongated forms silhouetted against the glow. They crept toward the observatory, moving from shadow to shadow. Lena's skin prickled as they passed a group of the tethered. Up close, their forms were more horrifying. Patchworks of human features melded into their blackened flesh, as if they were experimenting with what it meant to be alive. Ethan led her to a side entrance, its metal door hanging crookedly on its hinges. Inside, the air buzzed with energy, the blue light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The core was in the central chamber, a massive machine that looked half organic, its surface pulsating like a heartbeat. Tendrils of light stretched from the machine to the ceiling, connecting to the frozen sky above. Lena stared in horror. What is it? Ethan didn't answer. He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. They're not fixing the sky, he said quietly. They're replacing it. What? Lena whispered. Ethan turned to her, his eyes glowing faintly now, his voice tinged with something alien. I told you they needed us. Lena stumbled back, her crowbar raised. No, you're... His body convulsed, his limbs snapping into sharp, unnatural angles. The glow consumed him, his voice dissolving into the hum of the machine. The tethered were here. Lena ran, her breath ragged as the whispers filled her mind. She swung the crowbar wildly, striking one of the tethered as it reached for her. It disintegrated into ash, but more came, their forms moving faster now, more deliberate. She reached the core, its pulsing light almost blinding. Desperate, she raised the crowbar and struck the machine with all her strength. Sparks erupted, and the tendrils of light writhed like severed nerves. The tethered screamed. The ground shook violently, the walls cracking as the blue light intensified. Lena struck the machine again, and again, until it collapsed in on itself, a deafening roar filling the chamber. When she awoke, the sky was moving again. Clouds drifted lazily, the sun rising over the horizon for the first time in months. The tethered were gone, their forms reduced to piles of ash scattered across the ruins. Lena staggered out of the observatory, her body battered but alive. The city was still broken, but it was quiet now, peaceful. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. The apocalypse came in waves. The first was the disappearance of the sun. One morning, the sky simply stopped shining. No light broke through the endless grey haze that enveloped the Earth. Scientists theorized about solar obstructions, atmospheric collapse, even alien intervention. None of it mattered. The world grew colder, crops withered, and the nights stretched endlessly. The second wave brought the screams. At first they were faint, distant cries carried on the wind. They came at dusk, echoing across empty fields and deserted city streets. No one could pinpoint their source, but as days turned to weeks, the screams grew louder, nearer, and then they started taking people. Now, 6 months into the endless twilight, the world was silent, but for the whales. Humanity had retreated, hiding in ruins and underground shelters, hoping to escape whatever hunted the surface. Most survivors didn't make it long. The whales always found them. Marlowe crouched in the shadow of a toppled bus, her breath clouding in the freezing air. The streets of the once bustling city were desolate, blanketed in a thin layer of frost. Buildings jutted like broken teeth into the grey sky, their windows shattered and dark. She adjusted the scarf around her face, her gloved hands gripping the shotgun slung across her chest. Ahead, the road was blocked by a collapsed overpass. Marlowe had seen it a dozen times during her scavenging runs, but this time something was different. Tracks cut through the frost, fresh and unmistakable. They weren't human. Her heart sank as she traced the clawed footprints to a nearby alley. She knew better than to follow, but the thought of another survivor, someone alive in this hollow, dying world, pushed her forward. The alley was narrow, choked with debris. Marlowe moved cautiously, her boots crunching softly against the ice. The air was heavy, and a faint hum reverberated through the walls around her. She gripped her shotgun tighter. Halfway down the alley, she found the source of the tracks. A man crouched against the wall, his body shivering violently. His clothes were tattered, his hands raw and bloody from clawing at the frozen concrete. "Hey," Marlowe said, her voice low but firm. She kept the shotgun raised. "Are you hurt?" The man didn't respond. His head lolled to the side, revealing sunken eyes and a face gaunt with starvation. His lips moved, forming silent words. "Hey," she repeated, stepping closer. "What's wrong with you?" The man's eyes snapped to hers, wide and bloodshot. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a piercing wail erupted, so loud and shrill it felt like needles driving into her skull. Marlowe staggered back, her hands flying to her ears. The scream echoed down the alley, reverberating through the city. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound cut off. The man slumped forward, lifeless, and then the shadows moved. Marlowe barely had time to react before a figure lunged from the darkness. It was humanoid in shape, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms too long, its legs bent at unnatural angles. Its face was a blank mask of pale flesh, featureless except for a gaping mouth that stretched impossibly wide. The creature let out a guttural screech as it charged. Marlowe fired, the shotgun blast echoing like thunder in the narrow space. The creature's chest exploded in a spray of black ichor, and it crumpled to the ground, twitching. She didn't wait to see if it was dead. Marlowe turned and ran, the wails of more creatures rising in the distance. By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, the sky had darkened further, the endless twilight giving way to near total night. She found shelter in the ruins of a church, its stone walls offering a semblance of protection. Inside, she lit a small fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the cracked pews and shattered stained glass. She checked her supplies, 3 shells left, half a canteen of water, and a few scraps of dried meat. It wasn't enough. As she sat by the fire, the wails returned, distant but growing closer. She knew they were hunting her. They always were. Marlowe pulled a small notebook from her pack, its pages filled with scrawled notes and maps. She flipped to the last page, where a single word was written: Beacon. The rumours had spread months ago, an old government installation in the mountains, broadcasting a signal that could repel the creatures. No one knew if it was real, but it was the only lead she had. The journey to the mountains was brutal. Days bled into nights, the freezing winds gnawing at her skin. She avoided the cities, sticking to forests and abandoned highways, but the wails were always there, haunting her steps. One night, as she made camp in the hollow of a fallen tree, she heard something new. Beneath the wails was a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground and air. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound burrowed into her mind, dredging up memories she'd tried to forget. Her family's screams as the creatures descended on their home, her own cowardice as she ran, leaving them behind. When she opened her eyes, the world felt sharper, colder. The pulse was gone, but its echo lingered in her chest. The mountains loomed ahead, their jagged peaks shrouded in mist. Marlowe's strength was nearly gone, her body aching from days of travel. But the thought of the beacon, of a safe haven, kept her moving. She reached the base of the installation at dawn. It was a massive structure, half buried in the mountainside, its walls weathered and overgrown. A faint light flickered from within, and the rhythmic hum she'd heard before was stronger here. Marlowe pushed through the heavy doors, her shotgun at the ready. Inside, the air was warm, almost suffocating. The walls were lined with monitors, many of them shattered, their screens flickering with static. In the centre of the room was a massive console, its surface covered in buttons and levers. A single monitor above it displayed a countdown, 000237. What the hell? Marlowe muttered, stepping closer. The hum grew louder, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift. She turned, her heart racing, but saw nothing. Then the wails began again, deafening and close. The creatures were here. Marlowe scrambled to the console, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of the controls. The countdown ticked down, 000112. Behind her, the door buckled as the creatures slammed against it. Their guttural cries filled the air, drowning out her thoughts. Desperate, she pressed a series of buttons. The console roared to life, the monitor displaying a single word: Purge. The doors burst open, and the creatures flooded in. Marlowe fired, the shotgun blasts barely slowing them. One leapt toward her, its claws slashing through her jacket. She screamed, slamming her hand against the console. A blinding light erupted from the walls, accompanied by a deafening pulse. The creatures writhed, their bodies disintegrating into ash as the light consumed them. Marlowe collapsed to the floor, her vision swimming. When the light faded, the room was silent. She awoke hours later, the console's hum now a soft, steady rhythm. Outside, the sky was lighter, the haze beginning to lift. The beacon had worked. For now, the wails were gone. But as Marlowe stepped into the dawn, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The light had driven back the darkness, but it hadn't destroyed it. The horizon still wailed. The world ended in silence. There were no great explosions, no meteor strikes or wailing sirens, just a whisper that began in the corners of the world, spreading like a virus. The governments called it the dissolution. One by one, cities fell quiet, their streets empty save for piles of dust and ash. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. Humanity was unraveling, and with it, the laws of reality. Mia crouched beneath the remnants of an overturned car, clutching her frayed backpack to her chest. The air tasted of soot, a metallic tang clinging to her tongue. Around her, the ruins of what was once San Francisco sprawled like the corpse of a great beast, its skyscrapers jagged bones jutting into the sky. It had been 3 months since she'd heard another human voice. 3 months since she'd seen anything living that wasn't trying to kill her. Stay quiet. Stay hidden, she murmured to herself, a mantra that had kept her alive this long. Her voice was barely audible, drowned out by the faint hiss that always seemed to linger in the air now, a sound like static or whispers in the dark. She adjusted the straps of her mask, a patchwork thing made from scraps of cloth and duct tape. Breathing the open air for too long wasn't safe anymore, not because of the ash, but because of what it carried, the things that had come after the dissolution. Mia's eyes darted to the horizon, where the shadows grew unnaturally long. The sun was setting, and with it came the screams. It had started small at first, people disappearing, entire families vanishing from their homes. Authorities thought it was mass hysteria or some kind of elaborate cult. But then came the recordings. Cameras captured people dissolving into ash, their bodies unraveling as if plucked apart by invisible hands. Those who survived spoke of voices, gentle, beckoning whispers that grew louder the longer they ignored them. They called it the calling. Mia had heard the whispers too. Everyone had. But unlike so many others, she hadn't answered. She'd seen what happened to those who did. Their eyes would glaze over, a serene smile spreading across their faces before their bodies crumbled into nothingness. It didn't matter how far you ran. The voices found you. They always did. And then there were the other creatures, the ones left behind in the wake of the dissolution. No one knew if they'd come through the veil or if they'd always been here, hiding in the shadows. They had no names, but survivors called them echoes because of the way they mimicked the voices of the dead. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the city plunged into darkness. Mia lit a small LED lantern, its feeble glow casting flickering shadows on the cracked asphalt. She had to find shelter before they came. There was an old apartment building 2 blocks away, its skeleton mostly intact. It wasn't safe to stay in one place for long, but the darkness was worse. She moved quickly, her boots crunching softly against the ash-covered ground. Every sound felt magnified in the silence, the whispering static growing louder with each step. Halfway to the building, she froze. Something moved in the shadows, a slithering, unnatural motion that made her stomach churn. She turned off the lantern and crouched low, holding her breath. The static grew louder, and then she heard it, a voice she knew all too well. "Mia," it called, soft and familiar. It was her brother, Aaron, but that was impossible. Aaron had answered the calling months ago. "Mia, help me," the voice pleaded, closer now. The sound of footsteps echoed in the empty street, uneven and shuffling. She tightened her grip on the knife at her belt, her heart pounding. The thing stepped into the faint moonlight, and Mia felt bile rise in her throat. It looked like Aaron, his face, his clothes, but it wasn't him. His eyes were empty sockets, his jaw unhinged at an unnatural angle. Ash fell from his skin with every step, his body barely holding its shape. "Mia," it said again, its voice cracking like static. "Come with me." She bolted, her feet pounding against the pavement as the thing gave chase. The apartment building loomed ahead, its entrance a yawning black void. She dove inside, slamming the rusted metal door behind her. The creature's footsteps stopped just outside, and for a moment there was silence. Then the whispers began, louder now, echoing through the building. They weren't just outside, they were everywhere. Mia stumbled through the darkness, her lantern flickering back to life. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols etched into the plaster that seemed to writhe when she looked at them too long. She found an old stairwell and climbed, her legs burning with effort. The whispers followed, growing louder with each floor. By the time she reached the top, they were deafening, a cacophony of voices calling her name, pleading, cajoling, demanding. "Stop it!" she screamed, clutching her head. The whispers faltered for a moment, replaced by a low, guttural laugh. You can't run forever, the voice said, deep and inhuman. You belong to us. Mia backed into a corner, her knife held out in front of her. The room was empty, but she could feel them, echoes pressing against the edges of reality, their presence distorting the air like heat waves. The lantern flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Panic clawed at her chest as the static grew louder, the whispers now a single, unified voice. Mia, it said, there's no escape. She closed her eyes, bracing for the end, but then she felt it, a warmth in her pocket. She pulled out the strange device she'd found weeks ago, a sleek black rectangle covered in faintly glowing symbols. She didn't know what it was or why it seemed immune to the dissolution, but now it pulsed with light, humming softly. The echoes recoiled, their voices turning to shrieks. Mia pressed the device against the wall, and the symbols around her flared to life. The air grew heavy, and the ground trembled as a blinding light erupted from the device, banishing the darkness. When the light faded, the whispers were gone. The air was still, and for the first time in months Mia felt truly alone. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The next morning, she emerged into the ashen wasteland, the device clutched tightly in her hand. The world was still broken, and the echoes would return. But now, she had a weapon, and a reason to keep going. Somewhere out there in the ruins of a dead world, there had to be others like her. Survivors, fighters. She would find them, and together they would face the darkness. Because even in the ashes, hope whispered,